Brussell in Carmel, California. This is tape number 382. It's March the 30th, 1979, side 1, and another month has tucked away. It went pretty fast, didn't it? If there's one conspiracy going on for sure, I think it's the conspiracy of time. Either they're turning the clock too fast and the days are going too short, or I'm trying to do too much, because I never can get done in the weeks or months or the years what I'm trying to do. And in the meantime, I'm busy drawing wildflowers, painting Easter eggs, and doing a lot of other jobs, pulling weeds and doing a lot of other things besides the research, and it really doesn't seem like there's enough hours in the day. The power structure in the United States has been in conflict for a long time. The Eastern Wall Street group, headed by Rockefeller and various news media people in the East, versus the California, the Southwest, the armaments team that has been defined in various books, but not completely. I don't think that Carl Oglesby's book on the Cowboys and Indians really sets the tone as thoroughly as it should about this power struggle and what is taking place right now. California is the state to watch. California is where the fascism is going to come from. I'm terribly afraid of the shenanigans going on in this state, and I will call attention to them to you all along. And this isn't separate from Jonestown, because Jonestown, just like the SLA, was a combination of people brought from Indiana and brought from out of state to California, where the counterintelligence has really got their act together. This last week, when Governor Brown was in Washington on an energy conference, the Lieutenant Governor, Mike Curb, who's one that you have to watch and do research on, made an appointment of Judge Armand Arabian to the appeals court. Now, the appeals court is a very important court, of course, and I'll go into that in regards to Jonestown, the arrest of Jim Jones in Los Angeles. But he made the appointment, Mike Curb did, just while Brown was away, of a man who had been appointed to a judgeship down in Los Angeles by Ronald Reagan. He originally was appointed by Ronald Reagan, and Attorney General George Deukmejian, who's a friend of the new appointed judge, is on the commission member that passes the appointments of judges, so there's a definite conflict right there. We have a Republican, strong right-wing Attorney General and a Republican under Governor Brown as the acting governor, and he couldn't wait until Brown went out of town. I say Reagan because he's the protege of Ronald Reagan. And Mike Curb also made some other appointments while Brown was away campaigning. The word was campaigning, but he was actually representing an energy hearing there. And in Sacramento, there is a plant, a nuclear plant, identical to the one hit in Pennsylvania, so it's of interest. The energy problem is great here in California as elsewhere. But Mike Curb appointed Dwight Case, the president of RKO Film Company, to the Commission for Economic Development, Robert Wayne, the head of the Bob's restaurant chain, to the Commission of the Californians, and Al Zapata, former U.S. Interior Secretary, as executive director of the Commission of the Californians. He made those appointments while Brown was back east, but he put this appointment of Ronald Reagan's on the appeals court while Reagan had another man being checked out for the judgeship. Mike Curb did this. Now, Mike Curb is the man that was put in by Mr. Vogary, the man who's managing the conservatives for Congress in order to get an elected fascism identical to 1933 in Nazi Germany. And Ken Reitz works for this outfit. He was the financial manager of Elville Younger, but he also was involved in the secret dirty money at Watergate and was not prosecuted, and that money went to various persons who later were dead. William Mills was dead, and I'd written some articles about that. There was a car crash in James Webster, and it had to do with dirty money that later went into banks where various recipients of it were dead, and the mysteries were never solved. This Mike Curb is terribly dangerous. The appeals court is important, and he made this quickie appointment, as I say, when Governor Brown was out of the state this week. I also cited on several tapes, on these tapes, if you look back, there's tape number 357, this was October the 6th, where I talked about the investigation into the plane crash, the PSA plane crash, September 1978. Now, that was just one day before acting Lieutenant Governor Mervyn Dimely was going to expose some links of Mike Curb to some pornographic movie and some of his political career. It was Dimely versus Curb in the election. Dimely was scheduled to be on that plane. 144 people were killed, but instead of taking it on Monday morning, he went down to San Diego on Sunday night. But I think the investigation of that plane crash, I've talked about it on two different tapes, one in October and one later. And just yesterday there was an article, Faulty Training Cited in the San Diego Crash, America's Worst Air Disaster. They're still investigating, and they said it was a responsibility of the pilot because the control room told him to use his eyesight to land, and he thought the control room was helping him. And the article just yesterday said faulty training cited. Now they keep investigating that plane crash and also that terrible plane crash in Virginia when Senator John Warner won the seat against Mr. Obershane just at the time of elections. And I think that it's very important to get into this can of worms in some way. These plane crashes, the electoral policies, and last week I mentioned a couple that were killed in South Africa a week before an election, and South African money has been coming into the United States into Senator Hayakawa's funds, and Senator Hayakawa is very close to the very persons here being appointed and working their way up into control of the judicial and the electoral system. Just yesterday, Senator Hayakawa said that he's going to break tradition, that you don't oppose your fellow senators and politic against them, but he's contacted 4 prominent Californians to run against Senator Cranston, and he's talking about John Rousselet of the John Birch Society, Dr. Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb, Dr. Arthur Lafer, a USC economist, Dr. Glenn Dumke, president of the State College System, and Dr. Thomas Sowell, a black economist at UCLA. Now, Hayakawa is lining up against Senator Cranston. A lot of people, all to get out, all to campaign, raise campaign funds, and then they'll all pool together, which is what they did with Mike Curb. They had a list of 6, strong conservatives running for lieutenant governor, and then any one of them could pool in and help each other in the campaign and with the money. Now, Hayakawa was asked about his South African money yesterday in the talk that he was a lobbyist or received money from South Africa, and he made a remark that it's just a wild charge. There's no way of proving it. The charge was made by a former South African official living undercover. He didn't, and Hayakawa said he won't go into his campaign records unless he gets evidence that the money was contributed to him. And also the South African money, 10,000 of it went to Jerry Ford to give a speech in Houston, Texas, supporting the South African government, and now it turns out that $4 or $5 million went into the campaign to defeat Jimmy Carter, to the Jerry Ford campaign from South Africa. The South Africans that killed a man and his wife a week before election that have money coming into our Congress in addition to American money. There's a lot of money here that's going to swing this Senate and this Congress in a few years from now, so that it'll be the kind of Congress that Richard Nixon wanted, but which was halted by Watergate. There was an interesting article yesterday in the paper about Mike Curb appointing Mr. Arabian, this 44-year-old Republican, from originally appointed to the municipal bench by Ronald Reagan, and then promoted to the Superior Court by Reagan, and now put on the Court of Appeals. The aide for Mike Curb, a man by the name of Mr. Litton, made this remark, and I think it's interesting. He said that the unprecedented appointment was not an attempt to embarrass Governor Brown and should not be considered the opening salvo of World War III. I think World War III started the day World War II was over, but the manipulation of the courts and putting these people into power, the way they're being slipped into power through funding and blackmail and millions of dollars under the table, This has to be investigated because Mike Kerb is not qualified as a lieutenant governor. His political background is scary. The Reagan appointments, he's a protege of Reagan's, are in position, and even the very man who's handling this case, who met the press for Mike Kerb, made the remark about World War III. And I think that's where we're heading, and I think that the judgeships are terribly important. For those of you that want to know what's going on in this country, I suggest that you do a little homework into the background of Richard Voguri, V-A-G-U-E-R-I-E, and Ken Reitz and Mike Kerb, because and also Ronald Reagan. You better start going to the library and looking up some of the speeches and information on Ronald Reagan, because this is where the power is, and I noticed the way the Rockefeller death was smoothed away, and the three major parties came from California: David Lustig, Megan Marshak, and Poinsettia Pierce. Their California contracts or contacts in California, and the power base in California that does the manipulating is going to determine the efforts to get us back into a war with the Soviet Union. And if you don't study these names and keep them always handy and keep researching them and pushing Congress to research these things, you won't have the little bits and pieces that are leading us down this road towards this war with the Soviet Union. The one man that you can blame, if there's any blame to go now, for not making these names a household word, at least Ken Reitz and Richard Voguri, and then it would have cut off the power base of Ronald Reagan and Mike Kerb. The one man is Leon Jaworski, who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, was on the board of the Central Intelligence Agency Foundation in Houston, Texas. He was called in to be in the cell when Earl Warren interviewed Jack Ruby, along with Gerald Ford. He was called in at the time of Watergate to clean up the links of Watergate to the murder of President John Kennedy. He was called in at the time of Koreagate to hide the linking of our money in Southeast Asia going into mind control and sweeping up the youth and the Moonies and the cults and the spreading of the so-called Christianity ready for the next war. And he has kept quiet all of his information on these various assassinations. That's why he's called in. He's the big broom, former head of the Bar Association, to sweep under the rug the major investigations without them coming out. If he had done his Watergate investigation right, you would have nailed the money that Haldeman had in his desk that came from Ken Reitz and from various clandestine sources that was used it was involved with deaths in Maryland that could be linked to the George Wallace shooting, which also took place in Maryland. There is an article in the parade section. It's called Parade Special by Lloyd Shearer. Last week in the Sunday newspapers, the magazine sections, a syndicated paper. It came out March the 18th, actually. And there's an article about Leon Jaworski speaking at the University of California, of course, with their big investments in South Africa and elsewhere. And the article goes on to say that Leon Jaworski knows, this is a direct quote, where the skeletons of Watergate, Koreagate, and the Kennedy assassination and many other historic events lie buried. Now, this is the first time, actually, that a syndicated writer like Lloyd Shearer, who has a large page every week throughout the country, has come out and said that Jaworski knows where the Kennedy skeletons lie buried. I don't think he means Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone assassin. And for my mind, I think it's the first time that I've seen this printed by a major writer syndicated across the country saying that he knows where the Watergate, Koreagate, and the Kennedy assassination events lie buried. And it was because the Watergate was never investigated that the whole network, pardon me, for counterintelligence was kept intact. And most of the people that did go to jail went to jail for covering up, the crime of covering up, not actually for the George Wallace shooting, the Mary Jo Kopechne murder, the planning of riots in Miami, and the various dirty tricks or the drugging of Senator Muskie, and the many, many crimes that they did, forging State Department papers and so forth. Leon Jaworski is the man who sits on this, and it's because he sat on that and covered it from the JFK up through to the present that men like Mike Kerr are allowed to survive and make appointments on the appeals court. That's why the Kennedy assassination was so important to study, and is important to study, because everything goes back to who covered up the Kennedy murder and what are they doing now, how far will it go, and why are they protecting them. And the common denominator are certain names running through this, putting in new faces like Kerb or Ken Reitz, who's faceless, and not having them account to the courts of the sources of their funds or the accidents that followed, where their money went, or not investigating these crashes and the murders that precede elections so that the most conservative get elected and it continues to be covered up. Now to Jonestown. Last week on tape 381, that's March 23rd, I referred to a shredding of police records in Los Angeles. I mistyped the date. I'm not very good at typing, as some of you know. It's hearing in file, shredding case delayed, and I put 11/16/79. Well, being as we don't have an 11 yet, I know time flies, but not that fast. Just put 3/16 because it was news of the week, if you haven't already. And I have an article there that I referred to about 4 tons of police records being burnt. And I said that the LA grand jury will not prosecute the people who destroyed these files. And it was the city attorney who ordered these 4 tons of police complaints, charges that police harassed citizens, killed others, and so forth, were destroyed. And what I didn't put in here, I usually do this, give you as many names as I can. If you have the tape and the sheet from last week, write the name Bert Pines. For those of you who don't have it, who get this tape, try to get last week's tape, because 4 tons of material was destroyed by the Los Angeles Police Department in 1976. Now, among those files could also be information about Jonestown, but the same Bert Pines, whose name was written up in the articles last week and the week before in the Los Angeles Times newspaper, this same Bert Pines, that city attorney for Los Angeles, is the man who ordered the destruction of Jim Jones police records back in 1973 and 74. He was destroying police records then and locking them up and taking orders from the highest authorities in the state of California to destroy the Jim Jones police records in Los Angeles. I wrote in 1972, at the time of Watergate arrest, that Patrick Gray should be removed as acting director of the FBI because he had silenced the murder of U.S. Attorney Robert Meyer, the Isla Vista, Santa Barbara riots that were counterintelligence of the CIA, the Manson family killing, and the killing of Ruben Salazar, the reporter. And because he had ordered Robert Meyer, before he was murdered, to suppress these investigations, he then was in a position as acting director of the FBI to investigate Watergate. And later we found out that he destroyed valuable documents and deep-sixed them. So it seems that the intelligence team, the counterintelligence team inside the police department and inside the Justice Department and every level have certain people who destroy records, and their names keep running throughout the history. They become the great garbage collectors. I haven't indexed these sheets or the radio tapes I've done for the last years, but it'll be almost a year since we've gotten the printed sheet out. And I wish that somebody who takes the tapes would index them for me and that we could put them out in book form for all of you with all the names, so that it would be easy for you to refer to them during the years, the names that are on the tapes, or at least on these sheets, such as Bert Pines, who is a man who shreds the Los Angeles police records and then comes along with the Jim Jones case. Well, I wanted to give you an update on the arrest of Jim Jones in Los Angeles because it's a microcosm of what is going on throughout the entire United States. And then if we have time on this tape, I'll mention the similarities of this to the SLA and the Manson family. But I'm going to give you a summary. In 1972, there was a complaint in a church brawl against Jim Jones in Los Angeles, but that complaint is missing. I also have to say, in regards to the arrest of Jim Jones in Los Angeles, and I've said it Before, on other tapes, Jim Jones went to Brazil in 1960 and 1961, and he was with the CIA in Brazil. And then he went on back to Indiana, and then he came out to California just at the time that the members of the SLA were coming west, but he also was out here a little earlier in 1970 when he had been home from Brazil and then in Indiana and had formed his People's Temple. And in 1972 there was a complaint against him in Los Angeles, but that complaint is missing. In December 13th, 1973, Jim Jones was arrested by two members of the Los Angeles Police Department. There were complaints at a theater called the Westlake Theater in Los Angeles. It's just a short distance from People's Temple near MacArthur Park. And there had been lewd conduct in the theater, and they had picked up various homosexuals, and people were complaining about the behavior in this theater. So these two police officers, vice officers, were at the theater, and they were approached by Jim Jones, and before he went to the men's room, and then they went to the men's room, and he had taken down his pants and had directed his penis towards them and made overtures, and they handcuffed him and took him to the Ramparts Division Station. After the arrest, members of the People's Temple offered $5,000 to give money to a station fund, and one of the policemen said, Bob McIntosh, a police chief, lieutenant at the time, said the money was offered before the charges were dismissed, and he said it's a veiled bribe, and they talked about the lewd charges and the amount of the donation. Well, the arrest was December 13th, and they went into court January 31st, 1974, and February the 1st, 1974, the case was dismissed. 2 weeks after this dismissal, an aide of Chief Police Ed Davis of Los Angeles, who was part of the head of the criminal conspiracy section that hired Donald DeFreeze and Louis Tackwood, an aide of Ed Davis by the name of Frank Isbell from the Police Community Relationships wrote a letter to the People's Temple, member Dick Tropp, on behalf of Chief of Police Ed Davis. This is 2 weeks later, after his arrest, charges were dropped. And remember, this man is going to have youth down in Jonestown at his temple, wards of the state, welfare children. 1/4 of all the people down there that died of the 910 were under 16 years of age. And he was arrested on these homosexual charges that were by pressure of the city attorney were dropped, and then children were handed over to him. And 2 weeks after his arrest, Ed Davis, the chief of police's aide from the community relations, actually Frank Isbell, sent a letter to a member of the People's Temple. Thank you for your encouraging remarks. The depth of respect your congregation holds for law enforcement agencies in general and for this department, the Los Angeles Police Department in particular, is most gratifying. It is with similar respect for the excellent work that your church has done that I commend the fine leadership of Pastor Jones and extend our gratitude and congratulations. You know that in 1973, 72, when this was going on, in 74, when Jones was down there, Ed Davis was a livid racist, hated blacks, and this is a multiracial organization which I have alleged that L.A. Police Department member Fisk, he left the Los Angeles Police Department to work for Jolly West, and that mind control experiments on the poor and the black. This department was racist, and here was a morals charge of a man with black and white in the Zany Church, and there's a letter from the chief of police in Los Angeles commending them for their wonderful love of law enforcement. Now, the case of Jim Jones went to court and was dismissed, and the dismissal was granted. As I say, the letter from the chief of police came, but then the case got ickier. The city attorney, described in the San Francisco Examiner and the San Francisco Chronicle as just the city attorney, the Los Angeles Times refers to him as just the city attorney in this case, is none other but Bert Pines, the same man who 2 years later was going to destroy 4 tons of police records. The city attorney got a hold of the judge, Municipal Judge Clarence Stromwell, and ordered all records on the arrest of Jim Jones to be destroyed. And sealed, and the judge ordered that every agency of law enforcement destroy their records on the simple arrest of Jones in the theater. Judge Stromwell himself was a former police officer, and his reason for dismissal of the request of the city's attorney, which was Bert Pines, was that he requested it, and it was granted because Bert Pines might have had a reason. Judge Stromwell never said about the dismissal, and even today he doesn't remember it. The records were destroyed, sealed. They were ordered then to be destroyed, most of them, and they also refer to handing them over, some of the FBI and other agencies, which were the criminal investigation agencies, and I'm sure the CIA, because that's the agency that Jim Jones was with when he was down in South America. Now, this arrest in Los Angeles was similar to Lee Harvey Oswald going from Texas to New Orleans and meeting Mr. Carlos Bringuier of the CIA. Bringuier said he was expecting a federal agent to come. He was told that one would come. And then the two men had an altercation on the streets in front of this trademark where Lee Harvey Oswald was photographed passing out pamphlets. And a policeman picked up Oswald and put him in the New Orleans jail, and Oswald asked the captain there to call the FBI, and the FBI released him. The photographs and the handing out of pamphlets made it appear for Fidel Castro that Oswald was favorable to him, but Carlos Bringuier and the FBI and the captain of the New Orleans police dropped the entire matter, and he was let out of jail. And this kind of arrest of these two men, of Jim Jones, as lewd homosexual conduct, which he continued later into Jonestown. He had 10 women as wives, and he had all the men and the captains and the men around him bragging about his homosexual feat and having the women watch him do his homosexual acts and photograph them and so forth. The homosexuality continued on down to Jonestown, where people were the wards of Jim Jones, but it was suppressed. Arthur Cagle, Kagle, made the arrest, and when he found out the evidence was destroyed, he was furious, and he made an appeal. And this is where the appeals court goes, getting back to Mike Kerb's appointment of Mr. Arabian, the Ronald Reagan judge. He goes to the appeals court and asks for a new trial because the arrest was thrown out, and it was a clear-cut case of lewd conduct in an area where there were complaints of people at the theater that this was taking place. Now, not only did they get a letter from Ed Davis, but Tim Stone, the big wheel behind the Jim Jones affair, who set up Jones when he came home from Brazil up in Mendocino, Stone, a Stanford lawyer, you would think that if he found out that this seedy character was having homosexual relationships, he would cut off ties with him. He wouldn't have anything to do with him, this lewd conduct down at a crummy, porny theater down in Los Angeles by Westlake Park. No, what does Tim Stone do? In addition to lecturing around the country with his anti-communism and Jim Jones with his pro-law enforcement position in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, Tim Stone, who was the assistant district attorney in Mendocino, who had no business to conceal if the man he was working with was in fact a homosexual who was recruiting other people at a public theater, Tim Stone made contacts to 3 people. And those 3 people are still high up in law enforcement today. You see, the team is still attacked and functioning. He went to the police officials, Los Angeles Police Department, to a man named Dale Speck, who was the assistant police chief and in charge of criminal investigations, and he said, lock up all the arrest records on Jim Jones. Speck today is Director of Law Enforcement Division, California State Attorney General's Office. He contacted Mike Franchetti to destroy and tie up the arrest records to show that the man that he's going to work with and build this camp that they were just starting down in Venezuela and getting next to Venezuela and Guyana, walking distance from Venezuela, and don't forget that, it'll come up many, many times later. He's busy stopping the records so nobody will know about Jim Jones because they have programmed him and they're going to use him for a role. Mike Franchetti is now chief assistant to the state attorney general's office, which is Mr. Deukmejian, who is also close to the appeals court, and Mr. Arabian and the can of worms we talked about earlier on the tape. And he contacted the attorney general's office, who was Evel Younger at the time, who was the man who worked with Ed Davis and set up all the counterintelligence in the state of California for these various operations. And in the news media, the city attorney, as I say, his name was never given except by a private writer in Los Angeles by the name of Greg Roberts for the Reporter, the Hollywood Reporter. More about Jonestown on the other side of this tape. I see this side is up. This is Mae Brussell, tape number 382, March 30th, 1979, and this is side 2. We're talking about Jonestown and the arrest in Los Angeles and the criminal courts in Los Angeles. I think the arrest of Jim Jones is terribly important because it fits in, this new information about it fits in with what I've been saying, that Jim Jones was selected a long time ago. In Indiana, I'm going to do some next week on Dan Mitrione from the Defense Intelligence Agency, who came from Indiana, Jonestown. This was sent to me by some listeners in New York. I'm very grateful for that. I don't want to wander too far today, so I'll do that next week as a continuation of this. But the point is that I believe that Jim Jones was selected, and anything he did would be covered up because they needed him. They had groomed him for this role. Jonestown was to be an experimental station, and there were various purposes and motives that I've gone into and can do again for you and tighten it up and summarize what Jonestown was about, perspective, say, 4 months later. But right now I want to go into the arrest because Tim Stone from Stanford, who's going to go down to Jonestown, who's been accused of being in the Central Intelligence Agency, who's a staunch anti-communist, a Republican, a conservative, and helped set up Jonestown, a Stanford lawyer, assistant DA in Mendocino, and then took on political clout in San Francisco with a district attorney's office there in the important city hall appointments. Tim Stone was the man who went to the police chiefs, to the state attorney general's office, the attorney general himself, and then the U.S. attorney ordered the information destroyed. Now, Judge Clarence Stromwell took orders from a city attorney, this Bert Pines, to seal and destroy. He went up to Sacramento in '77 with Charles Gary to continue that this information be locked, to lock up, don't unseal. Now, in 1977, this is a year before the deaths were to take place, just almost exactly a year, Charles Gary's acting very innocent about what went on in Jonestown. It was a beautiful dream that was blown. Why did he fight as a representative of Jim Jones' homosexual charges when he knew, and must have known by now, that homosexual activity and sexual kinky sex that was going on, the punishment that went with it, not just the homosexual act, but the kind of degradation that he associated with sex that Jim Jones was doing with members of his temple, making them get undressed, take their clothes off publicly, and analyze their bodies and tell them how ugly they were, and punish them and have them have sex up on the stage if they had made overtures to each other, heterosexuals. This is the kind of person that Charles Gary was representing with the judge as late as 1977. Don't you think if he is representing Jim Jones that he would want to know what the charges were in Los Angeles, being as all these young people are in the custody of a man way down in Guyana that no one can get to in '77? But the same judge who's acting so innocent about it now went with Charles Gary in October '77 and said, don't open this up. There was an appeal by the police who had arrested, and they said, lock it up and don't unseal. It was February the 1st, 1974, that the FBI, the police, and other agencies were reported to destroy information on the arrest, and the dismissal was granted. Judge Stromwell granted the dismissal, and even the court reporter's records were missing. Now, what happened? Jim Jones was arrested, and what was destroyed later, the arrest records were destroyed except for several pages. One account in the newspaper this week, the Los Angeles Times, covered it and said that there were 14 or 16 pages of information, 14 pages of documents that have been declassified that were available. The San Francisco Chronicle said that 7 documents, including a 3-page letter from a doctor, were unsealed. Well, they had ordered the arrest records destroyed. They ordered the links to all other law enforcement agencies, naming the FBI, the CIA, which is a criminal investigation, which is the statewide unit that was run by Evel Younger, the Attorney General, and other agencies, if he did work for the CIA, other agencies besides the police, the CIA, and the FBI, to destroy anything about Jim Jones. They destroyed a later arrest record, which took place. They said there was no cause. They destroyed that. They destroyed the court reporter's notes of both the hearing where it came up and requesting the dismissal and also the dismissal. The court reporter's notes are gone. They don't have any record on why the dismissal was allowed. They usually have a record on why the dismissal was allowed. They left the name of the city attorney off who said to cool it. It was Bert Pines, who destroyed the other later records in '76. And they still don't have the name of the prosecutor for the city attorney who took it before the judge to request the dismissal. The prosecutor's name is gone. Well, because of Jim Jones' controversy in the news after so many people died, there was a request to open up these files and see what went on. So the only reporter actually doing work, as I mentioned just before the other side of this tape, I hope it wasn't cut off at the end, is a writer, Greg Roberts, a young writer. Maybe he can send you copies of the article if you send him some money. I'll give you his address, where he names the city attorney Bert Pines, because that's a very important name. And I'll give you a place where you can write to Greg and send him some money if you want some more information on this case. Well, because of so much notoriety, they said they would open up these records, and there's a discrepancy here again, whether it's 7 documents or 16. But what happened was that this week, Judge Stromwell was handed the records that have been sealed since 1974 on Jim Jones, but he went an hour earlier, according to the San Francisco Examiner, and had access to the records first, so they went on to say we still won't know, because he could have sanitized and removed papers as of this week of March 23rd, 1979, Monday of this week. The records were delivered, and Judge Stromwell had access. Instead of them being opened before everybody, he had them an hour before anybody. And he's the same man who went with Charles Gary in '77 to keep it suppressed. So when they opened these files, they found the excuse for the dismissal. They haven't answered any of the questions. Was the $5,000 a payoff in addition to the police department? Jones had a great contact with them. They tried to present one document, the basis for the dismissal, and they came up with a letter from a doctor the day after Jim Jones was arrested. December 13th he was arrested, and December the 14th a Dr. Alex L. Finkel sent a letter down to the judge, and he said the reason that Jim Jones pulled out his penis and was masturbating and aiming it at these other men or procuring them, would you believe this? This is from the San Francisco Chronicle, was that he had prostate trouble, that he had to jog or jump in place, and it looked like that he was playing with himself, but he was just really urinating because he had to jump in one place, and that his exposing himself in the theater to these various policemen was simply an error. Dr. Alex Finkel said Judge Stromwell had ordered the case dismissed and sealed, but it was only because he had prostate trouble. And 7 papers were released according to the San Francisco Chronicle, 16 according to Los Angeles Times. The city attorney's motion to dismiss the case had been granted. This is according to the San Francisco Chronicle. Jones wasn't present in court, but they claimed, Dr. Finkel said, that Jones had the obstruction of an outlet of a urinary bladder due to an enlargement of the prostate gland in 1970, going back 4 years earlier, that he had an inflammation of the prostate, and that even before Finkel had written the letter, he knew Jim Jones. Finkel's office is just 5 blocks from where the People's Temple was to be later in San Francisco, and that he heard that Jim did a lot of jumping or jogging in order to urinate. Now, this is the first time I've heard that story, but this is what the court produced. It's comical and it's sad, but this is what they produced. Now, Judge Stromwell, who ordered that all this be locked up, said that he wouldn't take any questions or answers, that everything that would be sent to him would have to be in written questions, and that he would take some inquiries, but they'd have to be written down, and he'd have to consider what was written and asked to him. The Los Angeles Times has an article this week. The 73 court file in Reverend Jones is unsealed, and it fails to reveal why the lewd conduct papers were destroyed. Now, this is a lesson in media coverage for various researchers, young ones coming along, older ones, and so forth. The San Francisco Chronicle has a letter from a doctor telling why Jim Jones was cleared. It says, why the L.A. cleared Reverend Jones. The file's unsealed. That's the San Francisco Chronicle. The San Francisco Examiner says that the answers are still not known because when the letters were unsealed, the judge got a hold of them first, and we may never know. The Los Angeles Times covers the same story at the same time. 73 court file on Jones unsealed. It fails to reveal why the papers were destroyed. It goes on to this letter that they produced that near MacArthur Park, the police report, and it tells about him masturbating and showing his penis to the officers. And the various police officers were interviewed after this file was revealed, and they said that he was carrying on these activities down in the theater. Inside the theater, according to the policeman, Mr. Cagle, who arrested him, he made advances inside the theater prior going to the bathroom, and he wasn't jogging. He was sitting in the theater making advances to police officers, and they went on to say there was never any mention of a medical problem and little credence to the theory that his actions were therapeutic rather than sexual. The man who arrested him, who was shocked at the dismissal, said he was never told why the motion was made by the city attorney. Again, Los Angeles Times is using the name city attorney. They used Bert Pines for the file shredding thing for the past year, but when his name is in the news twice for the destruction of evidence, they refer to him as the city attorney, and they still don't know why he blocked it. Now, the only logical reason for blocking it, which comes from studying political assassinations and meeting people involved in these affairs, is identical to the story of the Manson family. And I don't know how many of you new listeners or new people taking the tapes remember the story I had on KLRB a long time ago with an interview with Preston Guillory. And he's from the Sheriff's Department in Los Angeles, and he quit the day that the Manson family was arrested because they were taken to the police station, then they were all released, and then they all left their place at Topanga Canyon and then went out to San Bernardino, where they were picked up later. And they had released all of them, and they had arms and weapons. They had a man on parole. They had girls under 18 years of age. They had narcotics. And he said, as he worked at the Topanga Sheriff's Office, that every time somebody in the neighborhood or the surrounding areas wanted to pick up somebody, the Manson family would arrest them. The orders were, turn all your complaints face down. Only the chief can see them. That was Chief Peter Pitches, who worked with the Howard Hughes Organization and the Central Intelligence Agency. And Peter Pitches and the Sheriff's Department had face down. Nobody could know how many complaints or what kinds, because no one was to touch Manson. And Preston Guillory, who's now a private detective in Los Angeles, said that the sheriffs believed that he was being trained to kill Black Panthers, and there would be a swoop and a lot of the Black Panthers would be killed. But actually it was to kill Sharon Tate and the LaBianca family and everybody in the Sharon Tate house, which later was to rub off on the Panthers with death to the pigs written in code on the door, and credit cards of the Biancas left in the black part of town. It was to start a race war and turn antagonism towards the blacks and make it look like the blacks had swarmed in to Middle America on the edge of Beverly Hills up there in this beautiful home and killed all these white people, pregnant and listening to music and sleeping and watching television, and then write Helter Skelter in blood on the icebox to link it to the Beatles and rock music and the degenerate youth using Charles Manson like a Jim Jones, Donald DeFreeze, these great leaders, these hypnotic leaders, the guitar, the fringe coat, the hippie, the hitchhikers, and that began the end of the hippie movement and the hitchhiking. It was very successful, orchestrated by the same people that orchestrated the Jim Jones going from Indiana down to Brazil, up to Mendocino, San Francisco, Los Angeles, in footsies with the racists and the justice teams, the lawyers, the Attorney General's office, the police department. In essence, Jim Jones was not meant to be arrested. He was not meant to have the record. He was simply gratifying his sexual needs, and he could buy them off. And not only did the police department get $5,000 for their fund, but that Reverend Jones gets a letter of commendation from the office of Chief of Police Ed Davis 2 weeks after the dismissal, saying what a fine law enforcement person he is and the good relationships the office has with Jim Jones. Donald DeFreeze had police records with the same Los Angeles Police Department. When he was arrested on a charge, he had asked Evel Younger, the Attorney General, to be a witness in one of his cases. And when he went to the judge and said, I want to come clean, I don't like the work I'm doing, he didn't like working for criminal conspiracy section and so forth, and all the dirty activity that he was into, he wanted to go back to Ohio. He had a wife and some children back there. When he wanted to come clean and come to the judge then sent him up to Vacaville, where the Central Intelligence agencies came in and did a mind job and controlled Donald DeFreeze with an entourage of white people, and particularly Emily and William Harris and Angela and Gary Atwood from the same Bloomington, Indiana area that Jim Jones came from. This was all overlaying, incidentally. I'm going to do a chronological overlay for you of the Jim Jones activity soon, and the SLA as being part of the same operation. But those police records and the destruction of them, the highest law enforcement in power today in California, in power today, is important because, again, this appointment on the appeals court, you see, when Gary and the judge, Charles Gary and the judge, go to the appeals court, they still lock up the records of Jim Jones, and this Regan appointment to the appeals court can make sure that all the dirty mischief stays locked up. That's very important. And all the courts, to have a new trial where a person is innocent, can be turned down. That's why the appointment on the appeals court is so outrageous, and how this Mike Curb rushed in while the governor's on an energy conference, which was not campaigning. He made a remark, and his aide made a remark. If Jerry Brown's out campaigning for president, he deserves what he gets. He was out on an energy problem because we have a problem in California with all these nuclear plants that they want to put up, and they want to put one up right in Sacramento. And he was back east on an energy problem. He wasn't campaigning at all. And Mike Curb used that chance to rush in a judge, Mr. Arabian, a Regan man, on the appeals court. And the Regan team with the Stanford cabinet, he said, if I'm president, I will use my cabinet from the Hoover Tower, the advisors for Ronald Reagan. Well, Dr. Goodlett, the doctor for all those black slaves that were shipped down to Jonestown, provided drugs for them. He was from Stanford Medical School, was there for 6 years at Stanford Hospital. Tim Stone, a lawyer from Stanford, set up the land down in Guyana with Jim Jones and worked with him in Mendocino and San Francisco. There's a can of worms here. Sometimes I go too fast, and sometimes I repeat myself, and maybe not enough to tighten up the importance of the moving of people out and the courts and the way these people are getting into position in courts, such as the appeals court, that controls whether you get a new trial, innocent, or whether your charges get locked up to hide your guilt. And that's why that Mike Curb, Vagary Kenritz, Ronald Reagan, Tim Stone connection is so terribly important, that appointment of that judge this week by Mike Curb. Now, one of the men that was in on the arrest and the appeals prediction of Jim Jones, a member of the Los Angeles Police Department by the name of Mr. Marchesano, had been with Jim Jones at the temple prior to his lewd arrest. He had visited the People's Temple. He was a contact of the Los Angeles Police Department prior to the arrest, and as soon as Jim was arrested, he called Mr. Marchesano and said, help me get out of it. He was one of the LAPD who had been there, who had supported the People's Temple. But one of the things he said, and this was in the San Francisco Examiner just 2 days ago, March 28th, he said that when he went to the People's Temple and he gave some simple speech, as a member of the Los Angeles Police Department, that the people roared around him, and it wasn't funny, and they were laughing and roaring. And he said at that time, in 1973, the people appeared to be programmed. And he was perturbed also about the security there, that they had guards, and he didn't say weapons, I guess they were bodyguards. And he felt that they were locked in, that these black people at the People's Temple in Los Angeles had security, and they couldn't get out. He had the feeling that there was too much pressure on those people then, and that those people looked mentally programmed in 1973, that Jones was already programming them. And as soon as Jim Jones was arrested, he had sent $250 for the police fund, and then he contacted this man and said, help me. But even a member of the Los Angeles Police Department noted, and this was in the San Francisco Examiner, that the people were programmed and that the bodyguards were some kind of a threat to the masses inside the People's Temple. And that was before Jim was arrested for homosexuality or lewd conduct, and called that member of the police department who had been at the temple to help him get off those charges. Now, one of the excuses for Mark Lane being hired to represent Jim Jones, according to Lane, is that Jones knew of his interest in various problems, freedom of information, or where people are harassed, and yet every incident along the road shows the collusion of the FBI, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Post Office, the Federal Communications to assist Jim Jones. And in this case, you see another example where the LAPD agreed and dropped all charges, and not only dropped them, but destroyed the records and the court records, and ordered the CIA to destroy them and the FBI to destroy them. So I don't know where Jim Jones was being harassed, according to Lane. I understand that a federal agent went down directly to Jonestown from the States to deliver the money for Social Security and for the people that were harbored and enslaved and locked up inside Jonestown, went down personally. So I don't believe for a minute Mark Lane's story that they were harassed by federal agents. It seems like the Los Angeles Police Department, the district attorney in Mendocino, the courts, the San Francisco courts, gave him all the rope and leash he needed to continue the operation that they had set in mind as early as 1973 down in Jonestown. Penthouse has an article this month, an interview of Stephen Jones, and I may go into more details of that later, but Stephen Jones tells about his father. He refers to him twice as a socialist. Well, Hitler referred to himself as a socialist. That's perfectly clear, and this kind of activity of Jim Jones was a concentration camp experiment. But he refers to the fact that in the early 70s, his father opened churches in San Francisco and Los Angeles. He was down in Los Angeles. And in December 73, according to Stephen Jones, he flew to Guyana with his father and mother and more than a dozen other temple members. Now, we still don't know who those dozen are. I think it is mandatory that we write to congressmen or the people investigating the Ryan murder and so forth and get the names of these 12 people that went down there in 1973, because I keep saying, are they white? Are they from MIT, like Tim Stone said, or Grace Stone? Are they, one of them was this George Philip Blakey from London, with links to the intelligence community. Who were the dozen people? Because you see, the arrest of Jim Jones was in December 13th, 1973, and his son says that they went down to Guyana in December of 73, which was the same month of the arrest, and they went with 12 members of the People's Temple, and he said, we went to Matthews Ridge, which is 30 miles from raw jungle, not far from the border of Venezuela, and the handful of people went there at that time. Now, Matthews Ridge has been acknowledged to be a Central Intelligence Agency station, radio station, which was just 30 miles from where these slaves were being encamped and experimented in this mass suicide. But this is what Jim Jones' son says. He says in the early 60s, Marceline, his mom, and dad stopped here in the early 60s on a trip back from Brazil. So we went out to Matthews Ridge, and they showed us around. He says that they were at Matthews Ridge in this early period, going back when he came home from Brazil. They had been there. His mom and dad had been there. So we went to Matthews Ridge. He mentions it twice. It just borders Venezuela and 30 miles from what was to become Jonestown. Now, I think that's interesting because Jim Jones' son may not know or may not think about it, or maybe he knows, Stephen Jones, that Matthews Ridge was a CIA station. So they went to Matthews Ridge and then went 30 miles to look over the property in 1973. Now, Jim Jones was programmed in Indiana, which was a racist country. There's an article in the paper also this week about Jim Jones bringing some Cubans and wanting to take them down to Jonestown. And he had a Cuban with him up in Indiana, and he said to the Cuban, this is also in the San Francisco Examiner, now you stay indoors, don't come out, because they don't like blacks here. It's a racist city. He told him, you're too dark to be seen with me, so just stay inside. That was in the paper this week. And yet up front he had adopted these Oriental and black children, where a town where they bragged that the Klan kicked everyone out that was black. And in a city like Los Angeles with Ed Davis, who's so racist, with these black and white people mingling, all blacks under the control of whites down there. This is the same Stephen Jones who's talking about 73, the time that Jim was arrested, and he had been programmed to be this so-called leader like Donald DeFreeze. They had framed him for the many things that were to come down, the experimentations and the mass suicides that they were preparing. But Jones was down in Brazil. He was at Matthews Ridge, and that was why it is so important to cancel the arrest records of Jim at the time, either when he got home from the trip from Guyana, where they'd been with the CIA and had looked over the property in December 73 with these 12 people and said, yes, we'll take it, it's fine, we'll take the lease. Then he came home and was relaxing at the theater and approaching men for these lewd charges, who turned out to be plainclothes policemen because there were other complaints in the neighborhood and in the theater, or whether he was arrested for the lewd complaints December 13th and then went down to Guyana afterwards, like December the 20th or whatever, we don't know. But I will bet you anything, that the arrest charges were dropped by City Attorney Bert Hines and Tim Stone of Stanford Law, working with this clandestine CIA operation. I'll bet you that the importance of having those charges dropped was that these 12 men who were making the lease for this socialist experimental station down in Guyana had the power and had the clout to go to people, use Tim Stone to go to people like Dale Speck, Assistant Police Chief of at the time, now Director of Law Enforcement Division at the State Attorney General's office. They had the clout to go to Evel Younger. They had the clout to go to Mike Franchetti, working as a Chief Assistant to the State Attorney General's office also. They went to the Director of Law Enforcement Division. They went to these people because those 12 people who had rented that property in December of 73 were going to use this monkey. They had the morals charge hanging over him, sealed and some destroyed, but they were going to use him, and they couldn't lose him. They had groomed him from his days in Brazil. They had groomed him for his racism. He talked about blacks as niggers. They were ready to set up their segregated dining rooms, their special privileges for white. The white doctor was experimenting without anesthetics, telling them to be brave. Their great team, the basketball team they called it, that were their bodyguards. Those men that rented that property and those people that got the arrest charge off have some relationship to each other, and we have to find out who those dozen people are who went down there, those members, and rented that property at the time. Our time is almost up, and I'm going to do some more on Jonestown and the appointment of the judge in California. These are terribly important. They affect our future And then I want to do some more on the South African scandal next week if we have time, and how that affects our elections. And remember that Dr. Ernest Esikoff, who ordered the cremation of Nelson Rockefeller, is from Johannesburg, South Africa. He came over here in 1952. Johannesburg, South Africa has been putting millions into our campaigns and into England, the conservative government that just got the nod this week, yesterday. We're going racist, we're going fascist, and there are interconnecting links between these personalities and these experimentations. We'll do more next week on this. Get as many articles as you can in the meantime on the Jonestown arrest, the South African scandal, the appointment of Judge Arabian in California by Mike Kerb. Save all these because we'll be referring to them constantly, and there isn't enough time each week to get into a lot of this. I want to update you on a lot of this news. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and we'll be with you next week.